Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple Podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible.
A quick message before we get started. My name is Dylan, and I'm helping your host, Dr. Chris Kiefer, with a number of exciting projects to expand the podcast. Right now, we're working on a YouTube channel to have video interviews, transcripts for every episode, improvements to the website, and eventually, there will be ways for you to get involved yourself. Decouple will always be ad-free, so if you enjoy the show, please consider donating. You can find a link to our Patreon in the show notes and on the website, decouplepodcast.org. Thank you so much, and enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Nils Gilman, who is the Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute. He leads the Institute's research program, directs its resident fellowship program, and is also the deputy editor of Noema magazine. Dr. Gilman's most recent book is Deviant Globalization, Black Market Economy in the 21st Century. Nils, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
And for those of you who are kind of diehard Decouple listeners, you may recognize Nils. We did venture into COVID in this podcast on one episode, and it was a very interesting episode. I'd recommend checking it out, but talking a lot about sort of institutional decay within the West and some of the secrets of the successful responses, which I think have really held up largely in those Asia Pacific countries. But we've got something new to talk about today, which we'll get into shortly. But Nils, I like to get accolades out of the way and then get to know kind of what makes people tick, motivations and things like that. And we were talking about globes earlier. So yeah, just give us something kind of personal about yourself to humanize you to our listeners.
Well, I'm not sure it's going to humanize me that much, but yeah, we were talking earlier before the show got started about globes, because I noticed that beautiful globe you have over your left shoulder there. And I actually collect globes a little bit. I have several. And one of them I use as a conversation starter. It's actually from 1958. And the reason I sometimes ask people to look at, there's no date on it, but you can tell to within 6 months of when the globe must have been made, because the borders were changing so rapidly during those time periods that literally every 6 months in the 1950s and early 1960s, there was a new country becoming independent or a new country shedding an imperial overlord. And so really globes were, it was good for the globe business, of course, because if you were in the globe business
to update
and wanted an updated one, you had to constantly buy a new globe every 6 months during those time years.
Yeah.
So anyways, I've always had a sort of interest in maps and globes in general. I think a lot of historians probably do, because it's, the other side of thinking in terms of time is thinking in terms of space, and putting those two things together is often how I think about, how to frame problems in the world, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we live in an age which is, incredible in terms of the kind of travel that those of us in the wealthy West are able to do, and it's just absolutely a fabulous conversation starter. And actually, that segues a little bit into this topic. Today, we're talking about avocado politics, which Nils is going to introduce shortly. But just as a way to sort of segue into that, a lot of my sort of anxieties about climate change come out of my work as a refugee health advocate. So I've done a lot of work. Very intimate work with refugee claimants, documenting injuries, and it's a really incredible vehicle to sort of learn about the state of the world and get a flavor for the ways in which political oppression is manifested around the world and some of the causes of refugee flows, thinking about climate change and some of the stresses that might add just in terms of some of the physical stresses of sea level rise, areas becoming less habitable, shall we say, and also maybe times of austerity and things like that. But we have these documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. And, it kind of feels like they come out of this bygone era, obviously sort of post-war and coming out of a rejection of, the horrors of Nazism and fascism, I guess coming at the emergence of a sort of post-war economic boom when, the tides were rising and there was this more of a kind of welcoming attitude. I mean, sometimes when I look at some of the current realities, like, the rise of populist far right, these just seem like documents from a total bygone era and very much at risk of eroding. So with that in mind, We're talking about avocado politics. What is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So avocado politics is a term that I use slightly tongue in cheek, and it references another piece of fruit or another vegetable. So in the 1970s in Europe, there arose a series of green parties, so-called green parties, environmentally focused parties that were different from the traditionally class-based parties, which had been the substrate of European politics for a very long time. So you started to get these different kinds of interest groups that were interested in green politics, so-called green politics at the time. But in Germany in particular, a lot of the people who were leading the Green Party were former socialists and communists who had been disillusioned with the direction that socialism and communism was going, particularly after 1968 with the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so they were moving away from communism and embracing green politics instead. But there were a lot of people, particularly on the right, who saw these guys as basically rebranding their efforts to create socialist institutions under a new green rubric. And so they said, these guys are green on the outside, but red on the inside, ergo watermelons.
Yeah.
So avocado politics sort of takes that same idea, but says that the new green politics, instead of having a red, i.e. communist core, may in fact also, or there may be an alternative version of environmental politics, which has a brown, i.e. fascist core to it. So it's got a pit that's brown and an exterior that's green.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, really reverses a lot of the ways in which we've grown accustomed over the last 25 years in thinking about the environmental movement. The environmental movement, particularly in the West and in the United States, North America, is associated with a general kind of leftist politics, interested in, the whole earth and, inclusion and making sure that the poor whales don't get killed and so on and so forth. So it's been associated with a certain kind of empathetic leftist ethos. But there is another history to environmentalism, which goes back to the birth of the environmental movement over a century ago on both sides of the Atlantic, that came out of a very, very different political tradition that, on the one hand, led to actual fascist movements. It's not often remembered, for example, that Adolf Hitler had the most progressive forestry management program in the world during his years. Now, of course, that doesn't redeem anything else he did, but people sometimes say, well, was that sort of just an exception to the rest of his stuff? No, it was in fact organically, and I mean that literally, organically related to his, seeking of Lebensraum for the German people. He wanted to preserve the forests for the German people. The invention of organic agriculture happens under the Nazis with the Nazi agriculture minister, right? So these kinds of things have gone back a long ways. And I just wanted, when I wrote the piece on avocado politics a little bit ago, I wanted to sort of revisit those texts so that people can understand that what we may get as a result of the climate change situation that you're talking about is a reversion to that kind of green politics, a green politics which, instead of being inflected towards the left and towards watermelon politics, might in fact be inflected back towards the right. And I think this goes directly to the thing you were talking about, Chris, which is the point at which that will happen, I believe, is specifically around climate refugees. The hallmark of right-wing politics today in the West is anti-immigrant politics, right? It's keeping the immigrants out. And if we start to see a lot of climate refugees, or I should say, as we start to see a lot of climate refugees, because at this point, that's baked in quite literally into the atmospheric carbon we've already put into the air. As we see more refugees wanting to cross borders, wanting to go to places that have resources that can take care of it, we're going to see a right-wing politics. We are seeing a right-wing politics in response to that. And all it has to do is put those two things together, and you see the emergence possibility of an avocado politics.
So with that in mind, I mean, we're gonna plumb the depths of the past and get a sense of the origins. And you've hinted at that slightly, but let's talk about some of the present day manifestations, because I think, a lot of people, Greens, people in the environmental movement, if they've not been paying attention, might be kind of shocked by this idea of a rising avocado politics. So, and we're going to reference your piece on this. It was published, I think, in the Breakthrough Journal. That'll be in the show notes for sure, so people that want to dive in deeper. But a few examples, you mentioned this Austrian ruling coalition. I'm not sure if it's still in power, but it was an allegiance between a kind of far right populist party and the Green Party. You talk about the AFD, which is I guess, is it neo-Nazi or just ultra far right German formation. Give us some examples of these modern day maybe early manifestations of or rebirth or renaissance of this politics.
Yeah, I think, so look, it's happening primarily in terms of things that are already happening in actually existing politics right now. It's mostly a continental European phenomenon for the time being. It's not so much happening in the Anglo-American sphere. Right now, conservatives, generally speaking, in the United States and in Britain, for example, are climate change deniers, or perhaps just complacent about it, saying, hey, yeah, climate change is happening, but it's natural, or climate change is happening, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. But they're generally complacent, or worse, about climate change. But there are other people, particularly on the continent, and you mentioned Austria, you mentioned Germany. There's some of this going on in France as well, where there are politicians who are embracing environmentalist positions from the far right. So, for example, Marine Le Pen in France considers herself an environmentalist. And she says that one of the main ways in which we should stop increasing the overconsumption of things is stop more people migrating to France, stop more people migrating to Europe, right?
Because there's that famous saying that, I guess the best way to prevent a climate or I guess a carbon footprint from increasing is preventing someone coming from the global south to the global north. That's part of that rhetoric?
That's exactly right. And that's why in the United States, for example, the Sierra Club, as late as the mid 1990s, so only 25 years ago, was probably the most fervent anti-immigrant organization in the country.
And did that tendency in the Sierra Club actually lead to sort of legislative changes? Where I guess they were lobbying politicians?
They were lobbying, often in alliance with labor movement, actually, to try to keep immigration to a minimum. And they were against the amnesty that happened in the 1980s. They tried to reduce the quota of people who would be able to get visas, or rather get permits to immigrate to the United States or to become American citizens. So they were, absolutely, I'm not sure how effective they were. Actually, anti-immigrant politics have become more effective throughout the global north over the last, particularly 5-10 years. But their position was that the right environmentalist position was to be anti-immigrant.
Right.
So you have that going on in France. You mentioned the AfD, which is the far right party in Germany. The official position of the AfD is they're, I think, climate change deniers. But the youth wing of the AfD are in dissent from their seniors, their elders, and they are not climate change deniers, but they also want to do things like tie foreign aid from Germany, bilateral foreign aid to countries in the global south, to countries in the global south agreeing, A, not to send any immigrants, and B, to have a one-child policy.
Right.
And again, and they do this on the grounds, we can imagine the other motivations they might have for wanting brown people to have fewer babies, but the ostensible reason they have is an environmentalist reason.
That's the logic they're putting forward, the underlying rationale. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, that's definitely a phenomenon of the extreme right. When you look at some economic policy from the World Bank, there's certainly, it seems like there's efforts in the name of climate change to prevent large infrastructure projects that will increase the standard of living and the energy consumption in these countries. So it's not unique, but I think because it harkens back to some pretty horrible expressions of those politics. It's very potent. I guess the most extreme examples would be things like the Christchurch and the El Paso shootings and the manifestos that emerged from there. Without, I don't want to mention names because I want these people to disappear into history, but it is an important phenomenon. The ways in which they explained their actions. Can you go into that just briefly for us?
Yeah. So obviously there were these two horrible events. One was the live-streamed massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the other was the shooting at the Walmart, I believe it was, in El Paso, Texas, where dozens of people died in each of these incidents. And in both cases, the shooters issued or published just before they went on their rampage a manifesto. Actually, sort of hard to find on the internet now. It's been fairly successfully deep-sixed. But I read them afterwards, and they had what I would describe as cogent accounts of how the world was being overrun by brown people, and that this was terrible on its own merits, but also specifically a disaster for ecological reasons. There's too many people, and the people who are breeding most these days, the number of white people in the world is not increasing very much, because I think the birth rate for Caucasians, if you look at all Caucasians in the world, is about at replacement levels now, but population continues to increase. In other words, it's not white people that are growing the global population at this point. It's people in Asia, it's people in Africa, it's people in Latin America. That's where the growth is happening. And so, if they want to keep the world whiter, that means they have to get those people to stop breeding. And that's exactly what they laid out in their manifestos as a reason for, the massacres they perpetrated. I mean, it's terrible, but the logic there is, as I say, it's internally coherent, is the way I would describe it.
It's interesting as well, because it was very much framed in terms of kind of individual carbon footprints. And it's like, well, I think the El Paso guy was saying, because Americans seem unwilling to change their lifestyles and kind of be more green, the only solution is to get rid of to prune back some of that American population, and that fell along racial lines for this guy.
Right. I mean,
so it's like it's very like it's in terms of when we think about cogent or logical climate responses, it's very much not an individual response, and the kind of virtue signaling, which is so common, but it's these kind of collective responses, policy changes, decisions about energy sources. But it's just interesting that these right-wing justifications are kind of mirroring that very individualistic. Yeah.
I mean, look, I would say a couple of things about that are important to emphasize. One is that one can have an agreement about what the facts are concerning climate change, that, Western lifestyles, are not sustainable, even with the number of people who have them already, right? Much less if we try to extend that kind of, that lifestyle to all the people who don't yet have access to that lifestyle and want to have access to that lifestyle. And the people who already have it are unwilling to give it up, and the people who don't have it are unwilling to give up the dream of getting it. Those are all things that I think one can agree upon. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And here you can't derive automatically what we ought to do from what the is situation we face is. This is a point that goes back to the philosopher Hume. You can't derive is, ought from is. So we can agree about what the facts are. And I believe that what's going to happen, and this is the prediction in the Avocado Politics piece, is that as climate change becomes less and less plausible to deny, and as we get more consensus about agreement that the scientists are right about A, what's causing climate change, and B, what the effects of climate change are going to be, the assumption has been on let's say the green left, that once we get all these people to stop denying it, then they're automatically going to embrace, quote, our solutions to what to do about it. But that's not, to me, at all clear. One might come up with very different answers about what to do. And I would just point out furthermore that, like, if we're going to talk about what's realistic to expect, is it more realistic to expect that people are going to be willing to give up their, opulent lifestyles, or more reasonable to think that they might shoot people in order to maintain those lifestyles? Right? And, we see in places like Christchurch and places like, El Paso, that some people are taking that point into their own hands and say, like, look, no, it's time to shoot brown people, right? And they're justifying it with, an analysis of the environmental situation, which is completely in accord with what leftist environmentalists would say the situation is.
I think it's interesting because the kind of politics on offer, what the potential solutions are, and you talk about this in the essay with, kind of a Green New Deal policy. Everyone, when they recognize that there's a climate crisis, are going to want to embrace a progressive agenda, Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, these kind of things. And you say that that's, and you've just basically said that that's a very unlikely response coming from the political right. I guess the question I have for you, though, is, and we're going to get into this a bit later in terms of, how to inoculate ourselves or prevent these kind of politics from emerging or becoming dominant, are those Green New Deal policies, I mean, they're kind of sold as everything is a climate solution. And, you're saying in your essay that, even things that seem completely unrelated are, part of the climate solution. Clean elections are part of the climate solution. And I guess there's ways to sort of make tenuous arguments, but I guess my assertion would be that those social policies that create a more inclusive society, more equality, lead to more social trust, more trust and expertise, and maybe the way to diffuse these avocado politics? Is that
Well, I mean, look, I'd like to believe those things too. I consider myself a man of the center left, I suppose. And I believe that those are all good things to try to achieve. I do think that there is maybe a virtuous reinforcement cycle, that if you get more progressive politics, more progressive policies, then that will make people into more progressive people, more willing to trust in the institutions that are actually doing something beneficial for them. I mean, if we believe that there's a vicious cycle in the other direction, presumably we believe that there's a virtuous cycle possible as well. So I think that those things are all good. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think that you can derive those things from an environmental policy itself, from an analysis of the environmental situation. I don't think it becomes at all clear, because a lot of people don't want a world in which the government is telling them what to do, and
especially in America.
America, right? Where we've seen with the COVID crisis, we talked about the COVID situation, I guess 7-8 months ago. But what's become really clear is there's a lot of people who, in this country on the right, who just don't want to be told what to do, even if it's in their own interest. Right.
But I think some of that's a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the degree to which we're getting libertarian. And to me, it speaks to, and I think you've talked about this as well, the sort of decay in trust of the technocrats, of the institutions that formerly, made these material advancements like sewage systems, like electrification in rural areas. And that, as that trust has eroded, and, public figures that, make horrible mistakes, pay no consequences for it, there's a real reason why people don't have any faith in government, and why the Capitol was stormed, for instance. I mean, there's a real hatred of the political class and the elites. And I think it's arising out of the fact that people's, incomes and lifestyles are starting to stagnate and decrease, that there's no more good union jobs, et cetera. And I mean, that's the kind of politics that Trump very much played into. And, obviously a huge part of his platform was, building the wall, and these kind of anti-immigration policies. Let's shift gears a little bit though, and dive into the past, and where these things, you kind of teased at that earlier on in terms of talking about the environmental policies in Nazi Germany, but let's stretch a little farther back into the past and give us a sense of the kind of intellectual origins of these politics.
Sure, I'll try to keep this light and short.
Okay.
There's a deep intellectual history here, which is pretty interesting. But one place to start would be with the birth of the very concept of ecology. So the concept of ecology was invented by a German biologist by the name of Ernst Haeckel in the late 19th century. And what he was trying to do is figure out a way to describe the holistic systemic interactions that happen within what would later be called an ecosystem. And he wasn't quite as systemic as the people who started calling it ecosystems and ecosystem sciences in the 1930s and later. But like, he had the core idea that we should see nature as a holistic whole. And he was also one of the early leaders of the environmental movement, what would be later described as the environmental movement, specifically the conservation movement.
Right.
Now, one of the concepts that he develops in his theory of ecology and theory of conservation is the concept of living space, what he referred to as Lebensraum, which is the notion that all living systems within an ecological space need a certain amount of space in order to be able to thrive and realize their biological ambitions, as it were. And Lebensraum, of course, becomes a key word for the Nazis. It's the justification for the expansion and the invasion of Eastern Europe and the planned extermination of tens of millions of people in Eastern Europe, is to create Lebensraum for the German people.
And is that coming out of anxieties about like carrying capacity, or like these kind of limits to growth thing? Was that a concern in Germany? Was there a sense that there was a like impending environmental collapse, or anxieties about, the consequences of industrialization? Or?
Well, yes. I mean, so Tim Snyder, the historian at Yale, has written very much about this specific thing, that there were environmental concerns about the viability of the German people if they were constricted to the space that they were confined in, and that they needed to be able to expand. And so there absolutely were. Now, the term carrying capacity in particular hadn't yet really been developed yet. So it wasn't, that particular term didn't exist yet. There's an interesting intellectual history to that as well. Originally, the term was used not to describe human beings, but to describe the amount of freight that could be carried on a boat or on a particular transit space. And then it was used to describe the amount of cattle that could be sustained on a piece of land. And it was only very much later used to describe human beings and the number of human beings that could survive on the earth or in a particular space. But absolutely, I mean, Ernst Haeckel was a virulent anti-Semite, and absolutely saw the human species as existing in a racial hierarchy with, you won't be surprised, the Aryan and German peoples at the very top, and that they needed their living space. So, you know, this idea comes straight out of biological science in the late 19th century. And the Nazis end up picking that up in the 1920s and 1930s, and actually, implementing a version of it in the extermination campaigns of World War II. But it's not just a German story. I would also point out that this kind of a tradition and this linkage between conservationism and far right what we would nowadays describe as far right politics also existed in the United States. And here the key figure is somebody by the name of Madison Grant. Okay. Madison Grant was one of the founders of American conservation movement. Helped, was a forestry sciences professor, and was instrumental in inspiring Teddy Roosevelt in the first decade of the 20th century to set up the national park system and to expand that dramatically, and to have the federal government take over as much land as possible in the name of preserving it for, guess who? White people. Mm-hmm. And this politics was not subterranean. He's actually probably best known not for his role in the environmental movement, which the environmental movement has tried to kind of forget about, but actually because he wrote a book in 1923 called The Passing of the Great Race, which was basically a kind of a story that is similar to the story that gets told nowadays about white genocide, or what the far right figure in France, who's also an environmentalist, calls le grand remplacement, the great replacement. And so what Madison Grant was concerned about was all these immigrants coming to the United States. Remember, there's unrestricted immigration until 1924. And all these immigrants were coming to the United States and displacing the white people, and they were probably going to demand all this land, which he had successfully managed to have the federal government put aside in the form of national parks, et cetera, right? And he was worried about it. So he wrote this book called Passing of the Great Race, which was instrumental. And he testified on Capitol Hill, and the Passing of the Great Race was read into the congressional record. And it led to the 1924 immigration bill, which essentially put national quotas on the on immigration restriction. And for the next 40 years, the United States had a highly restrictionist immigration policy, wow. Which led to the percentage of foreign-born Americans, foreign-born people in the United States in just before this law was passed in 1924 was about 12%, which is about what we are at in the United States today. And it's about where we've been for most of our history, actually. By the time that law was reversed in 1965, the percentage of foreign-born people in the United States had fallen to just over 5.5%. So the percentage of foreign-born had gone down by half relative to the population as a whole, and it's now climbed back up to about 12% again.
I think it's interesting, like in terms of these anxieties about the environment. I'm not a historian, but I'm thinking about anxieties about the environment coming out of industrialization and the dark satanic mills and pollution, and I mean that's historically been very much a product of white people, and so this kind of displaced concern for the environment onto racialized people, just it seems a little bit counterintuitive and a bit bizarre.
Well, I think the thing to understand is that during that period, so the concern with pollution is really what the birth of what we would call the modern environmental movement is based on. Right. And here the key text is Carson's Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, which is generally considered the sort of founding document of modern environmentalism. If you want to say the pre-modern environmentalism that had existed in some ways since the early 20th century or the late 19th century was not about trying to prevent pollution, but about, and it was not called, it was called conservationism, conserving. Yeah. And the idea was that nature was treated as something separate from man, and it was meant to be treated as a set of reserves, what Heidegger, the German philosopher, referred to as a standing reserve for humans to exploit. And the question is, which humans are going to get to exploit those kinds of resources that are being conserved? Right. That's the sense that is perfectly consonant, the conservation movement, as opposed to the anti-pollution movement, with an anti-white, an anti-non-white kind of political ethos.
Right. And then, I think one of the fundamental differences between left and right politics is, at least in my simplistic sense, is on the right, it's sort of, we need to conserve things for kind of me and mine, or it's more of a reflection back on the family or the nation or the specific community. Whereas traditionally on the left, it's been a much more, encompassing thing about all of humanity, or the international, the international working class and those sorts of differences. So that's interesting. I mean, in terms of the national parks and things like that, I mean, there's certainly stories of indigenous people sort of being moved out of those places to, with this idea that nature is kind of untouched. And I guess just for white people to kind of have a nice hike and visit.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. There, the mythology, and it's a standing mythology in the United States, is that this was an empty continent. Mm-hmm. That white people, was there for the white people to take. Right. And, we now know, of course, that, first of all, there had been many, many more Native Americans prior to the Columbian exchange. The population of North America, there's a lot of disputes, and obviously there were no censuses happening prior to 1492. Right. What's very clear is that there was a huge, when European diseases, when new old world diseases arrived in the New World, it, sparked an incredible, die-off of humanity, much of which happened before the arrivals of Europeans. So there were whole huge civilizations in the Mississippi Valley that, precipitously declined long before any Europeans got to the middle of the North American continent. And it's presumed that this is because of a diseases that arrived in advance of the European diseases. Yeah.
We had Charles C. Mann on the show, and he's written 1491 and 1493, which look at sort of the Americas pre-Columbus and then the Columbian exchange, and globally the impacts of, international trade, and the recreation of Pangea in terms of like biologically is fascinating. And, a couple of the things that stood out for me was, Mexico was one of the first places that was invaded. And by the time that Pizarro got to Peru and famously sort of took over it led to the downfall of the Inca with like 150 soldiers, that the way that's told is just, the military superiority of this tiny group of almost magical godlike figures, conquistadores, but that the diseases had worked their way down through trade routes from Mexico to the Incan Empire. And something like 40% of the population had already been decimated by these European diseases at the time that contact occurred. And then the other fascinating anecdote was that the die-off of indigenous peoples was so high, something like 95% or even higher. There's hypothesis that the earth actually cooled as a result of carbon being fixed in areas that were becoming reforested from not getting regularly burned, or the landscape not being regularly managed. So I mean, that's just an interesting little like climate anecdote that I think it was called like the little, I don't know, the little ice age. Yeah, the little ice age. I'm not sure if it's true, but I mean, that's a fascinating kind of look at carbon balance and the ways in which
there was a global cooling phase, which ran from the late 1300s until basically the start of the industrial era. Mm-hmm. Probably the debates about exactly how you periodize it, but from, let's say, the late 1300s until the early 1700s. Of course, there's two waves of massive human die-off that happened. One is in the middle of the 14th century with the Black Death, which kills a third of Europeans, and it's not quite clear, but clearly many, many, probably similar numbers all across Asia as well. It doesn't affect the New World, of course, because it's still separated. But then when the Columbian exchange begins to happen, all these old world diseases arrive, not smallpox, plague, lots of fever diseases and so on. And yeah, I mean, the deaths and die-offs are legion. And the result is both in Europe, there's a reforestation that's sucking all those plants that are growing, those forests that are growing back are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere.
Wow.
So the CO2, and the same thing happens in the New World, both in the Amazon basin and in North America, where the population die-offs lead to a reforestation that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere in the 1500s and 1600s, and so continues to keep, even though European population, old world populations are rebounding at that point,
right.
New World populations are falling, and so you start to get reforestation there too. Once those populations stabilize, right, they start cutting down all the forests, and of course, why do we start using fossil fuels and start using? It's because we cut down all the forests, so we can't, cut down the forests anymore. England, they start mining coal in the late 1400s, because they're running out of forests, and they just keep going and going and going. And eventually, we do coal, we do oil, now we're doing
right.
natural gas and so on.
That's such a fascinating aside there. Let's get a little bit back into the avocado side of things, because there's obviously so many ways we can spin off in our conversation. I think we've been describing mostly like a pretty dedicated sort of xenophobic kind of ultra-right environmentalism. But I think it's really important to recognize the ways that mainstream environmentalism has been sort of infected or has carried some of these elements forward. And I think that would probably really hinge on concepts in terms of like the population bomb, Paul Ehrlich's work, which I think are pretty foundational to mainstream environmentalism. Rachel Carson being one of the founders, William Vogt, but this book had a major impact. I remember I saw an interview recently with Stuart Brand, and he'd been really involved in this population control movement. But can you talk about the ways in which that's a possible reflection or ripe fruit in terms of avocado politics moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the arguments I try to make is that catastrophizing is not likely to produce good political outcomes. And catastrophizing environmentalism really dates from almost the opening days of the modern environmental movement. So, we mentioned Rachel Carson a moment ago, and Silent Spring and the anti-pollution concerns. But the other major thread that emerges in the late 1960s comes from Paul Ehrlich, who writes this book that you mentioned, The Population Bomb, which is published in 1968. I think it's important for people to go back and try to remember what was happening with populations in the 1960s. The human population was growing in 1968 at 2.2% a year, right? And the curve had been going up and up and up like this. Now, why was it growing so fast? Basically, it's because, basic sanitation and basic healthcare is arriving in far-flung parts of the world where it hadn't existed before. Birth rates continued to be high because people still had expectations about wanting large families in many places, but death rates were falling dramatically, particularly death rates, infant mortality rates were falling very, very quickly because of improvements in neonatal care, basic care. So you start to have absolute explosions of population, all right? Now, where are those explosions of population happening? They're partly happening in places like North America, right? We have the baby boom in the United States, and there's similar kinds of phenomenon in places like Canada and Western Europe. There's sort of pent-up demand for babies after the long, dark years of the world wars and the Great Depression. And so there is a baby boom in the global north. But the real explosion in population, the baby boom begins to recede in the late 1960s. So the white people aren't breeding so much anymore, but the baby boom is continuing in the global south, and the death rates are dropping. And people start to look and say, well, wait a second, 2.2% a year, that means we're going to be doubling population every 25 years. There's 3.5 billion people on the globe. If we're going to double in 25 years, that means that by the 1990s, we'll have 7 billion. And by 2021, we'll have 15 billion. And by the middle of the 21st century, we'll have 30 billion people. And what are we going to do with all those people? So people start to think like there's a real problem, right? And the other thing that's happening during those years is there are repeated famines that are taking place in different parts of the world. And this is before the epical work of Amartya Sen, which explained that famines happen not for purely biological reasons, but for political reasons, fundamentally. That work hadn't yet been done. So people still interpreted famines in these very Malthusian terms. There's famines happening because there's too many people and not enough food. It's not what we now understand it to be is primarily an issue of distribution. It's an issue of too many, too many mouths to feed and not enough food to put in those mouths, right? So that was the dominant view. So we're doubling populations every 25 years. The Green Revolution was just beginning to come on that would increase the productivity of various kinds of crops, but people hadn't really fully put that in their heads. So you're like looking at old agricultural methods that people hadn't assimilated the Green Revolution yet. You're looking at incredible population growth rates. You're looking at the existence of famines that are happening, and many of which are now being televised live. The Biafra,
Right. Yeah.
the Biafra thing was mainly remembered in the West for all these starving babies with kwashiorkor, right? Who were being starved. Of course, they were being starved for very political reasons. The Nigerian government was trying to prevent Biafra from seceding and was going to starve those people into submission. It was not because there was a shortage of food in West Africa that the Biafran famine happened. It was because the Nigerian government was trying to bring the Biafran government to the table.
Yeah.
But these things were not yet fully understood at the time. And so when Paul Ehrlich publishes The Population Bomb, I mean, the term itself, right? The population is the bomb, right? It invokes a specter of course, when people talked about the bomb in 1968, mostly thought about nuclear weapons and apocalypse and Armageddon, right? And so now population is the bomb in Ehrlich's formulation. And this is a book, it sold many millions of copies, but I suspect it's one of those books that was more cited than read. It had a very memorable title. It captures people's apocalyptic imagination, which is something that we Westerners tend to have a fondness for. And so right there at the beginning of the modern environmental movement, you have this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric rooted in a population biology that's fundamentally Malthusian. And that leads to all sorts of ugly things that come out. There's another paper I'll just mention that's relevant that also is published at the same time as Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb. And that's a paper by called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Harden. Now, this is a paper that a lot of people have probably heard of, and the thesis is quite well known. That is that if you have shared resources and have not privatized property, people will overconsume those shared resources. Okay, that was the basic thesis that he made. And so he had an image of the commons, which were places of shared resources in medieval and early modern Europe. Before they were enclosed and everything, all property was privatized, where people had customary rights to graze or to hunt or to collect wood or what have you. And the argument that Harden made was that in the absence of either state control or private property enforced by state laws, there would be a rampant overconsumption because everybody would have an incentive to fish too much out of the river, take too much wood out of the forest, overgraze their cattle, et cetera. So, his proposal, first of all, was privatize everything so that everybody has a, right to, control their resources for themselves. So that was sort of a right-wing solution. He then takes it further. He reads The Population Bomb in the 1970s, and he writes another thing that he calls Lifeboat Ethics. Mm-hmm. Lifeboat Ethics, again, it's a very evocative image. He says, what is the ethics of a lifeboat? If you are on a lifeboat, your boat has sunk, and there's 10 seats on this lifeboat, and there's 50 people in the water. 50 people can't get in the boat, right? Otherwise, the lifeboat itself will sink. So you have to make a decision about who's going to be on the boat, and it might as well be first come, first serve. And then the people who haven't gotten in the boat, once all the seats are filled, too bad for them, right? And this was exactly the argument he made. He said, look, we have to allow people to die. All these famines, again, it's a Malthusian argument. It builds directly off of Paul Ehrlich's work. He says, we just have to allow all those people in India and Africa to starve to death because they breed too much. And that's just the way it's going to go.
But
right?
so were these ideas like embraced by mainstream environmentalism? Because again, I'm trying to sort of like compare and contrast, and I'm not trying to take cheap swipes at the modern environmental movement, but I think it's important to sort of analyze the kind of intellectual DNA that courses through them. And I do think there is a strong difference between sort of Nazi environmentalism and some of these other origins, different motivations, but there is still this underlying kind of Malthusianism that runs through it, anxieties about, birth rates, which tend to fall along racial lines, population anxieties. And I just think it's really important for the environmental movement to be aware of these things in order to inoculate themselves from it and not to lose kind of the humanist element in their environmentalism.
Yeah, I mean, so look, these things were not fringe ideas in the 1970s. They were part of the mainstream debate about what to do. Now, again, like, you know, Harden proposes something very specific in terms of policy, right? His lifeboat ethics principle, and it was, you know, there were a lot of people who thought that that was reprehensible, right? But the point is, it was not at all at odds. That conclusion was not refuted on a factual basis. That policy proposal was not like illogical, given the factual assessment that Ehrlich was making, right?
Right.
Now, Ehrlich himself didn't embrace lifeboat ethics. He thought we ought to do other things like, you know, have massive birth control campaigns all over the first world, all over the third world. And, you know, many of these people were, for example, very enthusiastic about China's one-child policy, which emerges in the late 1970s. It's proposed right after Mao's death. You know, China was considered the, you know, place with runaway birth rates, right? You know, it had gone from having 300 million people to having, you know, 900 million people by the mid 1970s. I think they were just about to crest over 1 billion people when the one-child policy was put into place. And you know, the Chinese themselves, I don't know specifically. I haven't looked into it whether the one-child policy was affected by the Paul Ehrlich population bomb thesis, but it certainly was something that Paul Ehrlich was in favor of, the one-child policy, when he heard about it for China. And we see it down to this day, right? I mean, I was mentioning earlier that the AFD Youth League wants to make loans or foreign aid conditional on imposing, you know, on countries in the global south agreeing to one-child policies, right? So, you know, this strand is there and it's been around for a long time. And I just think it's likely to come back because as the right, which has so far ignored environmental concerns, is forced by the facts on the ground of climate change to take those things seriously, they have this intellectual lineage that they can draw on for policy ideas.
Right. So let's move forward into sort of the closing questions of the interview, which I guess have to do with, you know, how to deal with this, how to prevent things degenerating in this way. What do you think are some of the vaccines or the kind of inoculations of the way in which we can prevent this phenomenon from spreading?
Well, I mean, what I would say is, in this I speak to progressive environmentalists primarily, or people who are sympathetic to the progressive environmentalist movement. I think one thing we need to do is we need to stop as much as possible with the apocalyptic rhetoric. Yeah. I don't like talk of emergencies or existential crises, or we only have 10 years left. You know, this kind of rhetoric that you hear from certain wings of the progressive environmental movement. I believe that, you know, and there's a lot of evidence for this in social psychology and political psychology. Senses of crises and, you know, emergency, generally speaking, don't get people to think in the terms you were describing earlier, Chris, of thinking in terms of large groups and mutual obligations of large people. It gets people to think, I got to protect me and mine, right? It gets people to constrain. You know, if I've got an emergency, the definition of an emergency is I've got to prioritize things, right? I've got to make decisions that some things are going to be more important than other things. And the things I'm likely to prioritize are the things that are closer to me than the things that are further away from me. That includes people, right? So I think, you know, the first thing I would urge, you know, progressives to do is avoid the catastrophizing. There's also a good empirical reason to avoid the catastrophizing, which is that, like, this problem is not going to go away in our lifetimes. It's going to be something we have to live with and manage. I mean, you're a physician, so you know this is like a chronic disease that we're going to have to manage, and it's a progressive disease. So it's a chronic progressive disease. You don't like tell people, you know, you need to change your lifestyle in order to deal with those things. You need to accommodate the fact that you're going to have to live in a different way if you don't want to succumb to this chronic, you know, progressive disease. And I think those kinds of things. Now, we want to, of course, maintain urgency about the issues at hand. And that's, you know, that's the needle that I think we as spokespeople on this topic need to thread, is how do we maintain urgency without creating panic behavior, right? Because people don't make good decisions when they're in a panic. And all the rhetoric, apocalyptic rhetoric, either gets people depressed or gets people to panic. And neither one of those things, generally speaking, produces the kind of politics that I prefer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what's interesting, I mean, I am definitely someone who is, I'd probably frame myself as being alarmed. I don't know if alarmist is the title I'd want, but, and I can see the sense of urgency, not that the world's going to end in, what is it, 9 years or something, but that, if we do want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we have a tight timeline to work on. If we want to stay below 2 degrees, it's less tight. But I mean, looking at the work of Václav Smil, for instance, and just seeing, how long energy transitions take, there's an urgency to the task at hand. And what frustrates me is that the solutions that are put forward by the mainstream environmental movement are so tied up in a sort of romanticism and a kind of harmonizing with nature, that they really risk being hugely ineffective. And they're also really tied up in concepts of kind of imposed austerity, which are never going to win over the demos or the people or the working class or whatever. So and there's obviously these ideas of kind of a World War II mobilization, which work against things that are imminent threats that we can really see, like the rise of fascism in Europe, for instance. That's easy to mobilize around, and climate being a kind of wicked problem, which is incremental and sometimes hard to see. It doesn't lend itself to that. I'm sympathetic to this idea of recognizing this issue, and trying to mobilize a large response. But yeah, it is. I guess you're saying threading that needle is really, really tricky.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I would respond to that. One is that I'm glad you brought the term wicked problems, which was a term that was coined in the early 1970s to describe problems that don't seem to have easy technocratic solutions. You were mentioning earlier that there's been a loss of faith in the ability of government and other elites to solve the problems that we're facing. And I think there's a historical argument to be made that there was a class of problems that were conceptualized in the 19th century as being things governments ought to be able to solve, providing universal education, providing infrastructure, et cetera. And governments eventually turned out to be pretty good at doing those things. There's another class of problems, though, that are much more thorny and because and they're not amenable to simple technological fixes. They are essentially about distributional and therefore political questions. And those things are things that elites can't really drive through with a technocratic logic and say, here, there's one best answer. You have to have, political consensus about who's going to win and who's going to lose with any solution you're going to come up with. And unfortunately, the climate crisis is a wicked problem. It's not something that can be technocratically dealt with. So the second thing I would say is we need to think about a bifurcation of the policy response to climate change. On the one hand, there's one set of things, namely climate change mitigation, that need to be driven at a planetary scale, okay? The carbon doesn't care about borders. So we've got to have enforcement mechanisms to reduce the amount of carbon. And some of that will be technological. I mean, one thing that's been, quite heartening, I think, is the rate at which the technology for renewables has improved over the last 15, 20 years. Solar has gotten much more efficient, much more quickly than most people were expecting. Wind has gotten much more efficient, much more quickly. It's still only a tiny fraction of the total energy that we need, especially as the whole global South wants to start using energy in the way that we do in the global North. But there is some hope that we can roll those things out faster and that governments can help, and that funding at a planetary level could accelerate the rollout of those things. I'm actually somewhat hopeful that some of the things we've learned in the COVID crisis might provide lessons for how to do that. So on the one hand, we need global institutions to deal with mitigation of carbon. On the other hand, I think we need to delegate down much more decisions around how to deal with adaptation to much more local institutions where people can be accountable, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna disagree a little bit on this, because I think eco-modernism as a sort of political environmental philosophy very much embraces the techno fix, and maybe is a bit short on the politics needed to achieve those things. But I would argue that there are examples in terms of the Mesmer plan in France and the nuclear build out there, which were very effective at creating a high energy society that was low carbon, and that does paint a potential path forward. But and it provided a technocratic solution to, I guess, the issue of rising electricity demand and economic growth. I think that the challenge is not so much that there is a technologic solution, but that the results are less visible, right? We invest all this money, we build a low carbon infrastructure, and it's going to solve a problem that's 50 years away in terms of the consequences that we feel. So we're not going to we're not going to see that result. And so, why invest all this money, or why change our policies in order to do that? Like, that's how I see it, as more of a wicked problem. Not that there's not, a technocratic fix. And I think we're really short on that sort of, when you look at the conditions, the politics that allowed something like the Mesmer plan to move forward, it was very much the product of a technocratic state. And again, we've talked about how, social trust has led to an erosion of belief and expertise, et cetera. But, it's.
Let me just double click on one thing you said, which I think is really important. A lot of what we need to do in terms of, reinventing our infrastructure is not sexy, fun stuff. I'll give you a metaphor for thinking about it. It's fun to do a remodel of your kitchen. It's fun to add a bathroom to your house, right?
Yeah.
I mean, those things add functionality. But it also is true that after a while, you may need to rip out all the wiring or replace the plumbing after your house gets to be a certain age. And those things are always really unsatisfying investments in your house, because you rip the whole place apart.
Yeah.
The place is a mess for weeks, right? It costs you a ton of money. And then you patch up the walls, and it doesn't seem like it's doing any better than it was before. You've just had a huge amount of expense and a huge hassle to basically, as far as you can tell, maintain baseline. But that's where we are right now. And the metaphor is this is not just a metaphor. We literally need to replace, in the same way you need to replace the infrastructure in your house once in a while, right? The plumbing, we need to replace the infrastructure for the entire system that we have. And it's not going to be sexy and fun, but it still needs to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of wrapping up, to meet this challenge, to avoid denigrating into avocado politics, we have to avoid catastrophism. I guess that's kind of your main message. We need to improve social trust through, and this is where I'm sympathetic to elements of the Green New Deal. I think that the technological solutions put forward in terms of wind and solar are not realistic, are regressive in a lot of ways in terms of what they do to electricity prices and who gets the rewards and the subsidies. But I am sympathetic to the need for a kind of social democratic eco-modernism, like Jonathan Simmons talks about, right? That there's a need to improve social trust through these mechanisms. And I'm not paraphrasing him well, but that is a real essential anecdote or antidote. And I think you sort of talked earlier about this virtuous cycle, and maybe it's pie in the sky, but that's I guess kind of my take thinking about this, because in reading your essay, it's very concerning. And I think some of that's faded into the background as COVID has sucked up the oxygen, but these are really mounting things. And I remember after those 2 shootings in 2019, it was, I think that's around the time that you wrote this article. It was really timely. Maybe concerns about this are slightly on hold at the moment as we're just dealing with COVID, but certainly something, that we need to pay attention to going forward.
For sure. I mean, there hasn't been practically anybody moving across borders for the last many months. for COVID reasons. But, we will get back to that world in some form or another when COVID either is over or just becomes part of the normal situation we have to deal with in one way or another. And when that happens, these kinds of politics are going to return, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, Nils, I could talk to you all day, and certainly have some other things I'd like to chat with you about maybe in future episodes. But thanks again for making the time to come back on Decouple.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, Chris.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.